This project has been made possible by the New Brunswick Environmental Trust Fund. In the spring of 2012, the UNESCO-funded Biosphere Reserve initiated a citizen-sourced climate data project. The objective was to establish the local effects of climate change through the experience of the community members. Part of this project examined the weather journals recorded by the Whitneys.
So the Whitneys are an older couple who belong to the same farming community that my parents belong to. So I've known them all my life. What they've been doing is making records for the last 30 plus years about their observations regarding the weather and the conditions around their farm. So they would record things like barometric pressure and temperature, day and night, and highs and lows, and then also some more unusual observations like animals that they've seen, or birds, or when some of the shrubs and plants are blooming or coming out in the spring or dying in the fall, things like that. Once we collected them from the Whitneys, we took them directly to students at Mount Allison University who are working with us on this project.
A lot of what we were doing was kind of searching for changes in seasons, so spring changes and a little bit too in the fall, but we were specifically targeting at spring and seeing when, say, frost would change and the peepers were out.
Their interests really kind of shine through in the journals. Things like frost and stuff like that were consistent, but lilacs, you could tell they were really focused in on that and in tune with that. And certain other things like the peepers and the frogs, things that you could hear.
Yeah, we could really see even how their family changed over time. It was a really cool tale of their lives, really. They knew what they were looking for, and they were out in their yard daily looking for these things each year. So although there is a human aspect to this data collection, as there is with most, you got to take it for what it is, and this is a representation of at least 40 years of what they had noticed. I think it takes someone who's really in touch with nature and understands the dynamics of phenological shifts and these kind of changes that are going on in nature. They must understand when certain birds should be coming in and when these weather changes should start to happen. Because over time they can kind of really actually see and mark down these phenological shifts that are going on.
This is really a local feel. It brings it back to home, and I think that's really important for most people if you can relate it to where they're from and show that, yes, like climate change is happening right now, it's happening in your backyard.
Yeah, the journals are something that I started practically the day we came down here from Toronto. So I just started keeping track of things, I think because I wanted to know when it was going to frost in the fall and when we could plant things in the spring. And that was part of the information that I needed. I thought, clever me, that I could figure out when the first frost would be, and then we wouldn't have to worry about it. The weather has its own methods of screwing up people's ideas of how they can outwit it. When I started taking records, I started pretty haphazardly. I think most of us do. A thermometer is handy. A barometer is handy. All you need, really, if you want to figure out what's going on is your eyes and your ears.
Having lived here for 35 plus years, you get very attuned to the environment.
When those spruces start to go wave back and forth, you've got a fairly strong wind blowing, probably about a Beaufort 7. We have, a certain variety of birds, a whole lot of redpolls that come down from the north every few years, and this is the big year for redpolls.
Sometimes we'll have one of those classic nights in the fall when the sky is clear, and I'll say, do you think we ought to cover the tomatoes, which is a job both of us hate. Getting up there at night and trying to cover up plants. He's got some formulas that make it easy for him to predict.
When the dew falls and the temperature's below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, it's probably going to frost. If it's above 40, then you're probably okay. And you check about 10 o'clock at night. We need to use our eyes and stop looking at dials and gauges and see what's there. There's no guidebook to experience. It's just something that comes to you.
You know, being able to look back over a period of time at this point in our history is kind of critical.
What happens to the journals seems to me important simply in the sense that that's a long period of record keeping.
He has always felt that, you know, maybe someday they would be of use to somebody.
I'm interested in growing degree days, which is a method of measuring warmth. I've always thought that it would be interesting to do some analysis that way, but I'm not a mathematician and I'm not interested in compiling all that information.
So the frost data is a really great example of how to record this type of data. They covered a long time period of 35 years, and the data they recorded was very consistent. They used a thermometer. They made sure they didn't miss any late frosts in the spring or early frosts in the fall, and we can be very certain about this data.
Over the past 35 years, the frost-free season at the Whitneys has varied substantially from as short as 111 days in 1995 to as long as 167 days in 2011. When we smooth out the yearly variability, a strong trend emerges, and we can see the average frost-free season length extending by 25 days, mostly further into the fall.
So the challenge of gardening in a northern climate is the shortness of the growing season. We've got frost in the spring and the fall that bookends that growing season, and for somebody coming from outside, such as the Whitneys, moving into the area, they really didn't know when that growing season started and ended. So it was really important for them to write down when these frosts were happening so that they knew when to plant their gardens. They wouldn't lose a lot of their hard work. But everything's not that easy, because a lot of the other things that they're recording in their yard, you have to know the timing of things, when things happen, and what you're trying to record.
I gradually realized that what I was interested in was what I could see for myself. The peepers in the spring and when they arrived and when the last peeper went back to the woods, or the hummingbirds in the summer. I didn't need to know the rainfall to a thousandth of an inch.
Spring peeper calls are one of the first signs of spring, meticulously recorded by the Whitneys every May. These tiny frogs spend their winter frozen under rocks, logs, or tree bark waiting for the warm air to bring them back to life. Peepers normally emerge from hibernation about 15 days after the snow melts, and that has been about 5 days earlier on average in recent years. The most interesting change in the spring peeper calling season is when it ends. Based on the Whitney's data, peepers are calling an average of 24 days later, making their season almost an entire month longer than it was 35 years ago.
So some of these bioindicators can be very specific to local environments. For example, if you live along a coastline, maybe you're really paying attention to when the lobsters move offshore. If you live by a lake, maybe you're paying attention to when the loons come back to the lake in the spring. If you live on a wetland, maybe you're paying a lot of attention to when the dragonflies start to fly. If you live on a mountain, maybe you pay a lot of attention to when hawks and predatory birds are migrating overhead. Each place has its own set of indicators, and the people that have been living in that place have learned what those indicators are and have often embedded that into local culture.
The rock maples, the sugar maples, start to lose their leaves at the top and gradually lose them down the stems to the ground, whereas the poplars start to lose their leaves at the bottom and lose them on the way up.
The emergence of tree leaves each spring is an iconic signal of the growing season. The Whitneys often recorded the spring eruption of maple and poplar leaves, with the maple typically bursting shortly after Mother's Day. The poplar used to follow towards the end of May, but recently they've advanced by approximately 9 days, taking advantage of an earlier spring while maple tree development has remained stationary. However, in the fall, maple has postponed average leaf drop dates by 5 days compared to 35 years ago, moving closer to Halloween before shedding their vibrant foliage.
The Acadian forest is a really unique area of the world where we have trees of northern affinities and trees of southern affinities, and they mix together in this Acadian forest region. And of course, trees are rooted in the ground, so they can't just get up and move when the climate changes or when the weather is unsuitable for them. So their response has to be in timing. And since we have this mix of trees, the response is going to be very, very different to climate change. So unlike plants that are stuck in one place and take many decades or centuries to actually move somewhere, birds and some insects are very responsive to changes in climate, and they can take advantage of moving weather systems and changing ecological conditions in some instances so that they can really keep up with these changes.
Birds can be important indicators of the weather, and the Whitneys paid particular attention to the spring arrival of robins and red-winged blackbirds. Both birds used to arrive in early April, but due to missing dates for some years, it's difficult to say with certainty. Using the data we have, the birds now seem to appear more often in March. On average, the red-winged blackbirds are arriving 9 days earlier, while the robins seem to arrive almost a full month earlier.
We really don't know exactly how climate change is going to affect all of those ecological connections. Migration of insects and development of insects is really important, and if those insects come in, they can start to remove certain trees from the landscape and create holes there in our forest ecosystem. When you think of the mudflats in the Bay of Fundy, upper Bay of Fundy, the shorebirds that come here, if they don't time that properly with the food resources that are available, or something happens to those food resources, then their populations could shrink and disappear. The biggest question that people have about citizen-sourced data is, does it stand up to the rigors of science? And in some instances, you can say it doesn't, but there is some value there. The lilacs is a good example because there was a lot of missing data, but we were able to use the different development stages to kind of patchwork that together and to really pull something useful out of that. If we do that in other cases where maybe we're missing some data, but somebody else has made those observations too, and we patch those together, then we can really get something solid out of there. And maybe it's not publishable in a scientific journal, but it's still valuable to science and to the general public.
Many people enjoy spring lilac blooms, and the Whitneys often recorded their development stages. Budding is the first stage and was only noted 29% of the time over the 35-year period. Leaf emergence was recorded more often, 54% of the time, and blooms were observed the most frequently at 57% of the time. Individually, there is a lot of missing data, but together they cover 83% of the years. The trends of all these lilac development stages agree and indicate a 7-day advance in spring emergence.
We really stand to benefit from climate change in several ways. The most important is our growing season and the ability for us to grow new foods. And growing season has already been getting longer, and it's going to be getting warmer, and we can grow new types of food here and have a longer harvest season. But on the other side, there are a lot of potential negative things that could happen, and we don't really know what the details are there. Now we're looking for things like trends and direction and where we're heading, and we know that it's somewhere different than we've been. And local knowledge and citizen-sourced data can really come in and help inform science and what is happening on the local level and what should science be focusing on.
This kind of data that we collected from the Whitneys is a perfect example of how important citizen-sourced climate data is to the region and to the communities and the people who live there, because we can do amazing things with data that comes from the people who really know what's going on the ground over a long period of time.
It's interesting to see somebody graph what what is in the books and get an idea from that, what the changes are.
The more sample sets and data points we have, we'll be able to see these trends that are coming out and these patterns that have changed over time, so we can limit that human perspective and see just a statistical trend.
I'm sure there are people around who've been doing them for years and years, and I would hope that material could be lodged someplace where it could be of use.
We're really keen to continue this project, and so we're always looking for more people to submit journals and records and diaries that are of this nature.
So far, we've just scratched the surface on what we could do with citizen source data. There's a lot more out there, a lot more people have it. It's probably sitting in boxes, in attics all over the place. It gets thrown into the garbage. People don't maybe value it because they don't know what can be done with it. But the more and more that we can gather this together, the more powerful it becomes.
Being in touch with the earth, being in touch with the things that move around us in the sky and in the land, give us a greater sense of the spiritual nature of the world. And so I think a lot of things that happen in the country build up a wider picture of the world around you.
And maybe it's down to the people too to put our efforts together to see what really is going on around us and to observe these changes that are happening fast and picking up speed.
There's also great benefit in people starting these kinds of records right now and continuing in the future because, as we know, climate change holds a lot of uncertainties, and this is one way for us to keep on top of those changes.
Start to learn about your backyard, your local environment, and start recording the things that you're seeing there. Just because you haven't been recording data up to now, that's no reason not to start now.
And a lot of this observation of phenological shifts has to come from humans. So at some point, we see our data and we know climate is changing, but how is it changing?
We often expect that there's somebody out there, somebody in government, somebody in the academic world that's always monitoring these things. And the bottom line is that monitoring is expensive. And to have somebody out there or have equipment on the landscape monitoring this stuff is not always financially possible. And there's a lot of things that are happening and changing in our environment. And it takes all of us to really be watching these things. Climate change is something that is caused by people. And it's not just some of us, it's all of us. We all have contributions, some more than others, but we all have contributions to climate change. We need to all work together, and everybody needs to play a role. And this is one interesting way that you can help the science community figure out what's going on and communicate those local changes.
If you or someone you know has been collecting bioindicator data in southeastern New Brunswick, we'd love to hear from you at the Fundy Biosphere Reserve. It doesn't have to be long-term, and it can be any type of wildlife-related subjects. Calendars, journals, or even scribbles on the back of a barn door all hold value.